John Harris awoke at 5:30 a.m., just as he had every morning for the last 50 years. The sharp buzz of his old digital alarm clock was unnecessary. His body didn't need reminding. It simply remembered. Even in retirement, even in old age, the rhythm of discipline never truly left a soldier. He lay there in the still dark of his small Aberdeen home, eyes open, listening to the familiar creaks and sighs of the aging wood around him. The cold bit at his joints before his feet even hit the floor, and when they did, he welcomed the discomfort like an old companion. He didn't bother with slippers. The cold was real, grounding. John shuffled to the kitchen, where a single chipped ceramic mug sat beside the sink, waiting for its purpose. The coffee maker had long since stopped working, but he brewed his morning cup manually, just as Martha used to when she was alive. It had been 6 years since cancer took her. 6 long years of silence broken only by the occasional sound of the television, the rustling of newspapers, or the wind groaning against the window panes. He stood at the sink, watching the steam rise from his cup, and let his gaze drift to the far wall. There, in the middle of otherwise bare surroundings, hung 2 things. A small wooden crucifix Martha had insisted be placed in the living room, and a faded photograph of her in her younger years. In the photo, she wore a blue Sunday dress, smiling with a grace that could soften any sorrow. Her eyes always found his, even across the room. John's hand instinctively moved to the left pocket of his worn brown coat, draped over the back of a dining chair. His fingers found what they always found: a cold, familiar metal object, a bronze star awarded for valor in Vietnam. He'd kept it with him every day for 50 years, more as a memory than a medal. Not for show. Never for show. His breakfast was plain: dry toast and a hard-boiled egg he didn't really want but knew he needed. At his age, even habit was a survival mechanism. But today, he barely tasted it. His eyes kept drifting back to the small wooden box atop the refrigerator, the one he hadn't opened in months. It wasn't until noon that he finally approached it. He brought the box down and placed it gently on the table. For a long moment, he simply stared. The sun filtered in through the blinds, cutting golden bars of light across the floor. When he finally opened the box, the soft crinkle of old tissue paper greeted him like a whisper. Inside was the flag, folded into a perfect triangle, worn but sacred. The same flag that once draped the casket of his best friend, Private First Class Robert Trask, who died in the jungles of Thanh Province, Vietnam, in 1969. That memory, like so many others, never truly faded. The smell of jungle rot, the endless drone of insects, the sickening silence after a firefight. It was all still there, filed neatly in the back of his mind, accessible only when he let his guard down. Today, he was letting his guard down. He touched the flag reverently, as if afraid to damage it, and then picked up the medal. The red, white, and blue ribbon was frayed along the edges, dulled from years of being pressed between his fingers. The bronze star in the center still bore the tiny V for valor. "I think it's time," John said aloud. His voice cracked from disuse. He had carried these things with him not for pride, but for remembrance. And now, with his health waning and time slipping ever faster through his fingers, he knew they didn't belong in a box anymore. They belonged somewhere they could speak for him when he was gone. The decision to visit the nearby military base, the Aberdeen Proving Ground, was not made lightly. Though he had lived just a few miles from it for decades, he had never once walked through its gates. There was too much there, too many echoes, too much pain. But today, the pull was stronger than the fear. He dressed slowly, deliberately. He put on the same coat Martha had given him for Christmas in 1997, now worn and patched at the elbows. The medal slipped into the left pocket, as always. He wrapped the flag in a clean white towel and held it gently in the crook of his arm. It took him 40 minutes to walk to the base. He passed through quiet streets, past neighbors who nodded politely, not knowing where he was going or why. The autumn wind tugged at his coat, and golden leaves skittered across the sidewalks like children in play. By the time he reached the main gate, his legs ached, and his breath came heavy, but he stood tall. The guardhouses flanked the gate like stone sentinels. Two young soldiers stood on duty, barely more than boys, John thought. Their uniforms were sharp, their boots polished, their eyes wary. One of them, with the name Mitchell stitched above his breast pocket, stepped forward. "Excuse me, sir. This is a restricted military facility. Do you have clearance to be here?" John offered a small, tired smile. "Good morning. My name is John Harris. I served in Vietnam. I was hoping to donate this flag and this medal to the base as a tribute." He held them up with trembling hands. Mitchell looked back at the second soldier, whose tag read Rodriguez. They exchanged a smirk, not of malice, John thought, just ignorance. "Go home, old man," Mitchell said with a sneer. "Nobody here wants your junk." John blinked. The words landed harder than any bullet he'd ever faced. Around him, other visitors waiting to enter the base turned to look, then quickly looked away. Some whispered, most simply moved on, uncomfortable with the unfolding scene. Rodriguez stepped closer, pulling out a radio. "Base to control," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "We've got a civilian disturbance at the main gate. Possibly unstable. Needs removal." Control responded with a static-laced, "Copy that." John stood frozen. The metal burned against his thigh. The flag in his arms suddenly felt heavy, like it had absorbed the weight of decades of silence. His heart thundered in his ears. A woman in the crowd whispered something about Alzheimer's. John looked down at the flag. "I just wanted to leave this in the right hands," he whispered, so softly it was nearly lost to the wind. "Before I go." Mitchell stepped forward again, his tone hard. "Sir, I need you to leave now." John looked up. For a brief moment, a fire returned to his eyes. The memory of June 15th, 1969, Tayin Province, roared back into his mind. The firefight, the ambush, 17 lives saved because he stood his ground and fought like hell. One of those lives was Lieutenant Thomas Patterson, the man who called John Harris the bravest soldier he had ever commanded. But today, none of that mattered. None of them knew. None of them cared. John nodded slowly, holding back the tears pressing behind his eyes. He turned and walked away, each step heavier than the last. The return home was a blur. By the time he reached his front door, the flag was damp with tears and the metal cold as ice. He placed them gently on the table beside Martha's photo and sat down in his recliner. The silence of the house wrapped around him like a shroud. He closed his eyes. Outside, the world kept spinning. But something had shifted. And not far away, inside the administrative wing of Aberdeen Proving Ground, General Thomas Patterson was finishing a routine call when a name, spoken in mockery by a group of soldiers, stopped him cold. John Harris, the man who saved his life. End of Part 1. Total word count, approximately 2,050 words, continuing to 5,000 in next reply. Continuation of Part 1. The Weight of Silence, full completion. Totil 5,000 ord. General Patterson satt stille i sin stol, väkten av navnet ekoende genom hans minne som det fjärne bråket av krigstrummor. John Harris. That name was engraved into his bones. The jungle heat, the chaos, the sudden crackle of gunfire and the smoke-choked air of the ambush, they came back with crystal clarity. And then, the silhouette of a man pulling wounded bodies out of the dirt, screaming for a medic, laying down cover fire without flinching. That man was John Harris. He turned to his aide, Captain Reeves. "Who just radioed in about a civilian at the front gate?" Reeves blinked, caught off guard. Rodriguez and Mitchell, sir. Said some old man was causing a disturbance. Wanted to donate something." "Did he give a name?" Not over the radio, no. Patterson stood, his jaw clenched. Get them in here, now. At that very moment, John sat in his dimly lit living room, arms wrapped around himself like armor. The clock ticked with painful precision. His mind replayed the exchange at the gate on a loop. He thought of Martha. What would she have said? Likely something practical and warm, like, "They're young, Johnny. They don't know yet." But even that didn't ease the dull ache in his chest. This wasn't just rejection. It was erasure. He stood slowly and walked to the bedroom, opening the closet. Inside, buried beneath winter coats, was a box of old letters and photographs. He hadn't touched them in years, but tonight he needed something, anything, to remind himself that what he carried was real, that it mattered. He opened the box and pulled out a photo of his squad. Some with cigarettes dangling from their mouths, others giving the camera a hard stare. Robert Trask's arm was thrown casually around his shoulders, his grin crooked and full of life. Beneath the photo, in faded ink, someone had written, Echo Company, Tyne Province, June 1969. He ran a finger across their faces. You all remember, he whispered. Back at the base, Rodriguez and Mitchell stood at attention in front of General Patterson's desk, both looking pale and stiff. I want to hear exactly what happened, Patterson demanded. Mitchell swallowed. Sir, an elderly civilian approached the main gate and said he wanted to donate a flag and a medal. He didn't have any ID or clearance, and he seemed confused. Confused? Patterson echoed. What else? Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably. We told him to leave. I called it in, per procedure. Patterson's eyes were cold. Did either of you ask for his name? The soldiers exchanged a glance. No, sir, Mitchell admitted. Patterson leaned forward. His name was John Harris. He served under my command in Vietnam. He saved 17 men during an ambush, including me. That man is a goddamn hero. Rodriguez's jaw dropped. Sir, we didn't know. No, you didn't. And that's the problem. You looked at an old man with trembling hands and saw someone forgettable. You never stopped to ask who he was. Patterson's voice cracked, not in anger, but in disbelief. This base is here because of men like him. Mitchell tried to speak, but Patterson raised a hand. You've both got about 2 minutes to get into a vehicle and go to that man's house. You will find him, apologize, and bring him back here with full military honors. Is that understood? Yes, sir. They turned and ran. John sat beside the window, staring out at the dusky street beyond. The silence was so deep, it almost felt sacred. Then came the knock. He turned slowly. Through the frosted glass of the front door, he saw the silhouettes of 2 soldiers. For a moment, he considered not answering. But habit, discipline, and the persistent echo of his own better nature moved him to rise. When he opened the door, Mitchell and Rodriguez stood stiffly at attention. Sir, Mitchell began, his voice tight, we've come to apologize. Rodriguez added, we didn't know who you were, sir. We didn't take the time to find out. We were wrong. John studied their faces. The arrogance from earlier was gone. In its place was something far more familiar, shame, and the first traces of understanding. Rodriguez continued, General Patterson told us what you did. We're here to escort you back to the base. He said it's time we did things right. John's throat tightened. He looked past them at the government-issued vehicle idling at the curb. He thought of the flag, the medal, Robert, the ones who didn't make it home. And then, quietly, he nodded. The return to the base was nothing like his first attempt. This time, the gates swung open at their approach. Patterson himself stood waiting at the entrance, flanked by uniformed officers and a small honor guard. As John stepped out of the vehicle, Patterson approached him with eyes glassy and voice firm. "Sergeant John Harris," he said, with the reverence of a prayer. "Welcome home." He extended his hand. John took it, gripping it firmly. "I'm sorry it took 50 years for us to do this," Patterson added. John offered a quiet smile. "Better late than never, General." They led him into the administrative building, where a table had been set up beneath a large American flag. Patterson motioned for him to sit, but John remained standing. He unwrapped the folded triangle of cloth and placed it gently on the table. Then, with a soldier's precision, he reached into his coat and placed the bronze star beside it. "I brought these," he said softly. "Not for me. For the ones who didn't come back." A silence settled over the room. Even the junior officers stood motionless, absorbing the moment. Patterson spoke. "Then let them stay here, Sergeant, where they can remind every soldier who walks these halls of what real honor looks like." John nodded. The medal and flag were placed in a glass case in the central hall of the base, beneath a bronze plaque that read, "In honor of Sergeant John Harris, Echo Company, 1969. For valor, for sacrifice, for carrying the weight of silence so others could live." Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in hues of blood orange and steel blue, John stood outside the base with Patterson by his side. "You've done more than anyone ever asked of you," Patterson said. John looked up at the flag atop the pole, whipping against the wind. "I just wanted them to be remembered. They will be, because of you." John smiled, and for the first time in years, it reached his eyes. He turned and walked home slowly, his steps lighter than they had been in decades. That night, the wind sang softly through the trees, and for the first time since 1969, John Harris slept without dreams. By sunrise the next morning, the story of Sergeant John Harris had reached every corner of the Aberdeen proving ground. It began with whispers in the mess hall, something about a forgotten hero being honored, a bronze star recovered from decades of silence, and 2 junior soldiers being publicly humbled by General Patterson himself. By noon, the story had made its way into emails, bulletin boards, and even the base newspaper. "Vietnam veteran honored after 50 years of silence." Attached was a grainy photograph of John, standing beside General Patterson, holding the folded flag in both hands like a sacred offering. Beneath it, the caption read, "Valor Recognized, Sergeant." John Harris donates battlefield medal and flag in memory of fallen comrades. Mitchell sat alone in his barracks room, staring at the article for the 3rd time that morning. He hadn't eaten breakfast. He hadn't touched the gym. He hadn't checked his phone. Everything about the previous day hung around his neck like a chain. He'd seen it in John's eyes, the weight of time, the sorrow tucked behind quiet strength. And he remembered the way he'd said it at the gate. "I just wanted to leave this in the right hands." Mitchell hadn't even asked for his name. He looked up as Rodriguez entered, holding 2 coffee cups. He handed one silently to Mitchell and sat down on the edge of the lower bunk. "You get any sleep?" Rodriguez asked. Mitchell shook his head. "You?" Rodriguez shrugged. "Dreamed about the gate. Dreamed he walked away and didn't come back." Mitchell sipped the coffee. It was cold. "We almost lost that moment." Rodriguez nodded. "We almost lost him." The room fell quiet. Neither of them said it out loud, but the guilt sat with them like a 3rd soldier in the room. Elsewhere on the base, in the administrative wing, Patterson was in his office, on a call with a colonel from Fort Meade. "No, Colonel, it's not about protocol," he said, keeping his voice even. "It's about conscience. We had a living legend walk through our gates, and two of our own nearly turned him away for good. He paused, listening to the response on the other end. I don't care if it's unusual. I'm extending a personal invitation to Sergeant Harris to serve as guest of honor for the upcoming Veterans Day ceremony. He's agreed to speak, and I'll make it clear to every man and woman under my command what it means to honor the shoulders we stand on. He hung up without waiting for a final word. Patterson stood, walked to the window, and looked out over the parade grounds. Soldiers were doing drills, running formations, shouting in unison. But somewhere beneath all that noise, he felt something beginning to change. A ripple in the current. The past reaching forward into the present, demanding not vengeance, but recognition, and maybe even redemption. That same day, John Harris stood at the kitchen counter of his home, preparing a pot of stew. He hummed quietly to himself, an old folk tune Martha used to hum when she cooked. Something about the smell of onions, thyme, and meat simmering on the stove brought her closer. For years, he'd cooked in silence, just going through the motions. But today, something was different. The silence wasn't empty. It was filled with a strange sense of peace. A knock at the door startled him. When he opened it, a young woman in uniform stood on the porch. She had a clipboard in her hand, a bright smile and nervous energy radiating from her shoulders. Good afternoon, sir. My name is Corporal Lena Daniels. I'm with the Community Liaison Team from the base. General Patterson asked me to check in with you personally. John blinked, surprised. Check in? She nodded. He said to make sure you're being looked after. Groceries, transport, anything you need. Also, she flipped the clipboard, revealing a form. We were hoping to set up a formal recording of your story for the base archive. With your permission, of course. John chuckled softly. I don't know if anyone wants to hear the old man ramble. Daniels smiled. Sir, with all due respect, the base is full of soldiers trying to find meaning in what they do. You lived that meaning. We'd be honored. He stepped aside and motioned for her to enter. Well then, I suppose you'd better try the stew first. That'll determine if I'm worth listening to. That afternoon, Mitchell and Rodriguez stood silently in the Hall of Honor, just beneath the newly installed glass case. The plaque gleamed under soft lighting. The flag, still folded with perfect creases, sat beside the bronze star, and for the first time, the two young soldiers read the inscription slowly, word for word. Rodriguez whispered, We judged a man by the shake in his hands, not by the steel in his spine. Mitchell replied, We have to do better. We will do better. At that moment, a group of cadets entered the hall for a scheduled tour. One of them, a fresh recruit barely out of high school, stopped in front of the case and stared. Who was he? The recruit asked. Rodriguez looked at him. A man who saved lives, he said, and who walked alone for 50 years because nobody thought to ask his name. Mitchell stepped forward and added, But not anymore. Now we remember. By the end of the week, John's story had spread beyond the base. A local journalist, following a tip from Corporal Daniels, published an op-ed titled The Silent Hero of Aberdeen. It ran in the Sunday edition of the Baltimore Sun, accompanied by a photo of John sitting on his. The snow continued long after the ceremony ended, soft flakes coating the base in a quiet stillness. Soldiers lingered on the parade ground, reluctant to move, reluctant to break the moment. Something had shifted, tangibly, unmistakably, in the atmosphere at Aberdeen Proving Ground. It wasn't just about a veteran being honored. It was about a reckoning, a realization, a long-overdue realignment of values. John Harris didn't stay for the post-ceremony dinner. He slipped out before the speeches resumed, leaving Mitchell and Rodriguez to answer questions, and tell what little they knew. When asked where John had gone, Rodriguez simply said, "Home. But I think he left more here than he took with him." 3 days later, the base's Veteran Outreach Office received an unexpected influx of visitors. First came Sergeant First Class Reuben Jefferson, a grizzled man with a silver star and a scar that ran across his temple like a forgotten battle line. He walked in without a word, set a small, tarnished medal on the desk, and whispered, "Been meaning to talk for about 30 years. Then came Corporal Alyssa Montanez. She brought with her a photo of her father, a Gulf War veteran who'd died of suicide in 2005. She hadn't spoken about it publicly since high school. He never wanted a parade, she said. He just wanted someone to listen. That afternoon, the outreach coordinator sent a memo to General Patterson. "Sir, whatever happened with Sergeant Harris, it's waking up ghosts, but the good kind. The kind that need daylight. Recommend we begin planning a permanent archive of untold service stories." Patterson read the memo twice. Then he stood, walked to the window, and watched a group of recruits jog past in cadence. Their voices echoed across the frost-covered field, sharp and alive. He nodded once to himself. "Let the ripple become a wave," he said. At a small VFW hall in downtown Aberdeen, something else was stirring. The bar usually sat half-empty on weekday nights, older vets nursing beers in quiet corners, the jukebox playing 70s rock, the TV permanently set to muted news. But on that Thursday evening, word spread that John Harris might stop by. He hadn't confirmed anything. In fact, he didn't even know someone had posted a flyer with his name on it. Local hero, Vietnam vet, guest of honor. He only found out when his neighbor, Mrs. Carmichael, rang his doorbell and held it up with a sheepish smile. "Thought you ought to know," she said. "The boys down at the VFW are hoping for a sighting." John stared at the flyer for a long time, his hand hovering near the doorknob. He hadn't set foot in a VFW hall since 1983. "I don't know," he said. Mrs. Carmichael stepped closer. "They remember you now, John. They see you. You don't have to sit alone anymore." That night, John put on a coat, brushed the snow off his old Buick, and drove slowly into town. When he entered the VFW hall, a hush fell over the crowd. Not because they didn't know who he was, but because they did. Reuben Jefferson stood from the bar and offered a sharp salute. The room followed suit. Veterans old and young rising from their seats, some placing hands over hearts, others with watery eyes and trembling smiles. John's throat tightened. He wasn't used to this. A young Marine approached with a worn notebook. "Sir," he said, "I'm writing letters to every living Vietnam veteran I can find. But I don't know how to start. Could you help me?" John took a deep breath. Then he reached for the stool beside him. "Son," he said, "you start by listening." Back at the base, Mitchell and Rodriguez found themselves increasingly drawn into mentorship roles. Their encounter with John had gone semi-viral after a base media intern uploaded a short clip from the ceremony, set to soft music with John's speech playing underneath. It was titled, "Every Man Carries Invisible Scars." Within a week, it had over 2 million views. Cadets began approaching them in the gym, in the mess hall, even during training drills. "What was he like?" one asked. "What did he say off camera?" another pressed. The two young soldiers never claimed to be experts, but they told the truth. "He taught us that strength isn't how loud you are," Mitchell said once during a base panel. "It's how willing you are to see someone, to really see them." Rodriguez added, "And that humility? It's not weakness. It's wisdom." Their commanding officer took note. 2 months later, Both men were promoted, not just for service, but for leadership. Quiet, moral leadership. Patterson, meanwhile, had begun planning something bigger than a Veterans Day speech. With help from Corporal Daniels and the base historian, he commissioned the creation of a new wing in the Hall of Honor, the Silent Stories Project. It would feature first-person accounts from veterans whose service had been overlooked, misunderstood, or buried under the weight of trauma and time. When Daniels told John about it, he simply said, "Don't put my face on it." She laughed. "We weren't going to, but we're putting your story in it." John nodded. "Good. Just make room for the others." They did. The day John received the first official draft of his oral history transcript, he sat at his kitchen table for over an hour, reading each line with care. He saw in the text things he hadn't said in years. "I remember the sound of the chopper blades after the explosion. I couldn't hear myself think, but I saw Ramirez reach for me. We never found his body. I wrote Martha letters every week. Sometimes I didn't send them. Sometimes I didn't want her to know I was breaking. I came home to silence, not parades, just silence. And I carried it for too long." When he reached the end, there was a final line that Corporal Daniels had added, with his permission. "But I am not alone anymore." He folded the paper, wiped his eyes, and placed it in the drawer beside Martha's wedding ring. By spring, the base had changed. It wasn't loud. There were no banners, no slogans, but young soldiers now attended monthly legacy talks, where veterans shared stories once hidden in shadows. Cadets were assigned to read personal histories from those who had served in Vietnam, Korea, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Not just timelines, but feelings. Regrets, fears, courage. One afternoon, during a field exercise, a recruit collapsed with a panic attack. His superior officer, instead of chastising him, knelt beside him and said, "I don't know your battle, but you're not weak for feeling it." That officer had been at the Veterans Day ceremony. He'd heard John Harris speak. John didn't seek recognition after that. He turned down a national interview, declined a medal upgrade review. He wasn't chasing awards. He had already received what mattered most: restoration. Not just for himself, but for the memory of those he'd carried for half a century. And every few weeks, he'd visit the Hall of Honor, not to admire the case that bore his name, but to read the new stories being added. One, in particular, always stopped him cold. He walked alone for 50 years, so others could walk together now. That story wasn't about war. It was about healing. Spring brought Maryland alive again. The trees outside John Harris's modest home budded in cautious hope. Tulips peeked out along Mrs. Carmichael's fence. The air smelled faintly of thawed earth and distant rain. But for John, the most profound change wasn't in the season. It was in the way people looked at him now, no longer with confusion or pity, but with recognition. Not fame, not reverence, just something honest and quiet, like respect reclaimed after a long misunderstanding. He still woke early, as he always had. Still made black coffee and fed the birds in the yard. Still kept Martha's photo beside the television. But now, every week or so, he received a letter. Some were from soldiers, young, old, retired, active. Others were from children, writing on lined notebook paper with crooked spelling. "Dear Mr. Harris, my grandpa never talked about the war, but after my mom showed me your speech, he started to. Thank you for helping him." One morning, a package arrived from a school in Alabama. Inside was a stack of hand-drawn flags, each one labeled, "For the soldier who didn't forget his friends." John sat at the kitchen table, fingers trembling slightly as he opened each one. A child's crayon world of red, white, and blue. Stick figures saluting. Tiny captions. Thank you for being brave. You are my hero. I want to be like you when I grow up. He laughed softly, shaking his head. You don't want to be like me, kid, he murmured, but I hope you grow up never having to. Word of John's story had moved beyond the base. After the Hall of Honor's Silent Stories exhibit launched, regional news outlets picked up the thread. Then national ones. Then a U.S. Senator from Virginia, herself a Marine Corps veteran, referenced the project during a hearing on military mental health. We speak of sacrifice in broad strokes, she said, but we fail to see the individuals who return in pieces. I urge this committee to look at the story of Sergeant John Harris. It is not just his story. It is ours. Within weeks, the Department of Veterans Affairs issued a formal statement recognizing the importance of lived experience archives as a tool for healing and connection. And so, the Harris Initiative was born, a national pilot program that placed story collection teams in VA centers across 12 states. Veterans could come in not just for blood work or checkups, but to sit down, one-on-one, and speak, to be heard, to be remembered, to be known. Back in Aberdeen, John was invited to attend the launch of the first community-led veteran storytelling circle at the town's public library. He didn't want a speaking role, just a seat in the circle. The room was small, maybe 20 chairs arranged in a rough oval. No cameras, no podiums, just voices. The first to speak was a man in his late 60s named Dwight, who had served in Desert Storm. His hands shook as he spoke. I've never said this aloud before, Dwight said, but I remember the day I saw a friend step on a mine, and I remember thinking it should have been me. I carried that guilt for 30 years. There was silence. Then John, sitting 2 seats to the left, nodded slowly. I understand, he said. I carried Ramirez for 52. Dwight looked up, startled, then exhaled. It was the beginning of something neither man had expected. Friendship built not on war stories, but shared silence. At home, John started writing again. Not letters to Martha, though he still talked to her sometimes while folding laundry or putting out seed for the birds, but pages in an old leather-bound journal. He wrote about the ceremony, the apology, the pride in Rodriguez's steady eyes, the way Mitchell had stumbled over his words but kept speaking anyway. And then he wrote about the things he still carried. The face of Ramirez, smiling as he lit a cigarette in the trench, the sound of chopper blades, the hollowness of arriving home to a country that had already moved on. Writing didn't fix it, but it lessened the weight. Each sentence, a stone taken from his rucksack. Each paragraph, a breath of air he hadn't taken in years. General Patterson visited again in mid-April. They met at the base cafeteria. Low ceilings, linoleum floor, the smell of eggs and weak coffee. Patterson insisted on no staff, no protocol, just 2 men side by side in a booth. You were right, Patterson said after a pause. This wasn't just about one man. John stirred his coffee. I wasn't trying to make a point. I just wanted someone to see me. See them. They do, Patterson said. Because of you, they do. He reached into his pocket and placed something on the table. It was a challenge coin, heavy, gold-rimmed, engraved with the base insignia and the words truth, honor, voice. John blinked. I didn't serve for this. I know, Patterson said. That's what makes it yours. John accepted the coin, but more than that, he accepted what it meant. He wasn't invisible anymore. Later that month, the town hosted its first Memorial Day storytelling vigil. Candles lit along the main street, each one honoring a life lost and a story left unfinished. John stood at the front, holding a candle for Ramirez. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The flame said enough. By June, Mitchell and Rodriguez were preparing to leave the base for new assignments. They visited John one last time before shipping out. "Sir," Mitchell said, "I owe you my perspective." Rodriguez added, "And probably my entire military career." John smiled. "You owe me nothing. Just carry the lesson." They hugged awkwardly, soldiers not quite sure how to show affection without orders to guide them. But it was genuine. Before leaving, Mitchell said, "You know, I think you changed more than just us." John looked out the window at the flag waving in the yard. "I didn't change anything," he said. "I just finally stopped hiding." One night, after the birds had settled and the sun had slipped behind the pines, John sat in his living room chair, wrapped in a wool blanket. He held Martha's photo in one hand, and in the other, a letter from a high school teacher in Ohio. "Dear Sergeant Harris, I teach 10th grade U.S. history. Every year we study Vietnam, but for the first time, we included your story. One of my students cried. Another said, 'Why don't we learn about this side of war?' You gave me a new way to teach truth, not just events." Thank you, John read it twice. Then he looked at the ceiling and whispered, "You see that, Mar?" Outside, lightning bugs danced in the darkness. Inside, for the first time in half a century, John Harris no longer felt like a footnote in someone else's story. He was finally the author of his own. The first week of July rolled in with humid air and thunderstorms that rattled the window panes of John Harris's home. He had begun to move slower, not from weakness, but from deliberation. His days were measured in simple acts: filling the bird feeders, reading a chapter from a well-worn novel, writing short journal entries about memories long buried. That morning, a call came from the base's archive department. "Mr. Harris, we've come across something during the digital reorganization of personal service files," the young archivist explained. "It's a personal letter, addressed to you, dated June 23, 1973. John froze. The voice on the other end hesitated. "We believe it may have been misfiled and never delivered. It's from someone named Martha." Silence. A beat passed before John found his breath again. "I'll come pick it up." He hung up without asking any further questions. In the archive room, a slim white envelope sat on the counter, yellowed at the edges, his name handwritten in blue ink. Sergeant John Harris. It was unmistakably Martha's handwriting. The archivist gave a polite explanation: how mail sometimes got lost or misdirected, especially from family to field hospitals or reassignment centers. But John barely heard a word. He simply held the envelope and stared. He took it home, placed it on the kitchen table, made a cup of coffee. Then he sat down, and with hands that trembled like leaves in wind, opened it. June 23, 1973. My dearest John, I don't know if this letter will ever reach you, but I have to try. I have to believe something of me can find its way to you, even across oceans, across everything we've lost. The baby's coming soon. It's a boy. I can feel it. He kicks like you used to run in the morning, stubborn and strong. I want to name him Thomas, after your father. You'd like that, wouldn't you? I pray every night that you come home. I don't care if you're broken, or quiet, or hurting. I just want you to come back. Not for me, for him. He deserves to know his father. But if you don't, if this world is too cruel, if the war has taken more than it had any right to, then I want you to know this. I never stopped loving you. Not once. I will tell our son about the man you are, the man who walked into hell so others wouldn't have to. He will know your name. He will carry it with pride. Come home to us, John. Or send us your heart. That's all that can make it. Forever, Martha John read it once. Then again. Then a third time. Slower. By the end, tears had carved quiet rivers down his weathered face. Not the kind that broke a man, but the kind that stitched pieces of him back together. He sat at the table for over an hour, the letter in one hand, the coffee cold beside him. And when he finally stood, he knew what he had to do. The next morning, he called General Patterson. "There's someone I need help finding," John said. "His name is Thomas, and if what's in this letter is true, he's my son." What followed was a delicate process involving military records, civilian archives, and one determined young specialist in the VA Research Division who had quietly made it her mission to reunite lost families. It took 3 weeks, and then, one Sunday afternoon, Patterson himself arrived at John's home, not in uniform, but in a navy polo and jeans, the look of a man not bringing orders, but something deeper. "I think we've found him," Patterson said. He handed John a folder. Inside was a photo. A man in his early 50s. Sharp jawline, eyes like Martha's. A calm, steady smile. His name was Thomas Ward, lived in Richmond, Virginia, worked as a high school science teacher, married, 2 daughters. John stared at the photo until it blurred, then looked up. "I never even knew he existed," he said, his voice hollow. "And all this time." Patterson didn't speak. He just placed a hand on John's shoulder. "We reached out," he added gently. "Told him we found something belonging to his mother. We didn't say more. We wanted to leave the choice to you." John nodded slowly. "I want to meet him." The meeting was set for a neutral spot, Shenandoah River Park, where families often picnicked and hiked. It was quiet, beautiful, and peaceful. John wore his best jacket, held the letter in a small envelope. Inside the park cafe, he sat by a window and waited. 10 minutes passed. Then the door opened. Thomas stepped inside. They recognized each other instantly. No introductions, no questions. Just 2 men who stood frozen for a moment, staring across time, both unsure who should speak first. Thomas broke the silence. "I didn't know until 3 weeks ago," he said softly. "She never told me. Just said you died in the war." "I almost did," John replied, "but part of me stayed lost." Thomas sat down across from him. His hands were steady, but his eyes shimmered with emotions he hadn't prepared for. "I have daughters," he said. "One's in college. The other plays the violin. I'm still trying to understand what this means." John passed the letter to him. "She wrote this when you were about to be born. It never reached me. Until now." Thomas opened the envelope slowly. He read. His breath caught. By the time he finished, a tear had slipped down his cheek. "I always wondered," he whispered, "why she looked so sad on my birthdays. Why she never talked about you." "I wondered too," John replied, "for 50 years. They sat together for over 2 hours, spoke of Martha, of war, of what it means to lose time you can never get back, and still have something to offer. By the end, John pulled a photo from his wallet. It was old, faded. Martha, in her wedding dress, smiling. "She was the best of us," John said. Thomas nodded. "She'd be proud you found your way back." That evening, John returned home lighter than he'd felt in years. He placed Martha, letter in a frame on the mantel, right beside her photo. And beneath it, he added a new one. A picture of Thomas, standing beside him, arms across each other's shoulders, both of them smiling through the weight of what they'd just reclaimed. The snow fell heavier than usual that December, layering Aberdeen-proving ground, in a blanket of quiet white. Streets shimmered under the hush of winter's breath. John Harris, now 78, sat near his front window, watching the snow fall with a worn journal in his lap and the soft hum of an old jazz record playing in the background. His body had grown frailer, his steps slower. But his heart, after decades of grief, silence, and isolation, beat with a clarity he had not known in years. The past was no longer a weight, but a story he had learned to carry, and more importantly, to share. Veterans Day had changed everything. Since that ceremony, John had become something of a figure on base. Young soldiers saluted him, not just out of duty, but out of reverence. Patterson had invited him to speak at leadership seminars. Mitchell and Rodriguez, now in officer training, wrote him letters every month. And Thomas. Thomas visited every Sunday without fail, always bringing something new: homemade soup, fresh books, old photos from Martha's collection. The bond between them, though formed late, had deepened with surprising ease. It was not a replacement for lost time, but a quiet rebellion against it, a way of saying, "We still have now." That winter, John did something unexpected. He began speaking publicly. Not grand speeches, but small, intimate gatherings, classrooms, community halls, even Zoom calls with high school history classes. He told the truth of what it was like to return from war into a silence no one knew how to break. One day, a teenager asked him, "Were you ever afraid?" John leaned forward, his eyes steady. Not of the bullets, of being forgotten, of waking up 50 years later and wondering if it all mattered. The room had gone still. Then a teacher whispered, "They'll remember now." One morning in early January, John didn't wake up at his usual hour. The house was quiet, the kettle untouched. Thomas found him in the armchair by the window, wrapped in a blanket, a photo of Martha in his hands, and his journal resting open beside him. The pen was still tucked in the spine. His final entry was written in a careful, deliberate hand. To carry silence is a burden. To speak is to begin healing. I go now with peace in my chest and the memory of brothers I can finally name again. And her, always her. John Harris had passed peacefully in his sleep, his eyes closed, his face soft with release. The funeral drew hundreds: soldiers, officers, neighbors, strangers who had only known his story from that Veterans Day video that had quietly gone viral. Thousands had seen the clip, John standing tall, handing over the flag, saying, "Today I give this flag and medal." Not as John Harris, but in the name of the brothers I couldn't save. General Patterson delivered the eulogy himself, his voice cracking only once. "We failed him once," he said, "but we did not fail him in the end. And more importantly, he did not fail us. He became our reminder of what service truly means, not just in war, but in life after." Rodriguez and Mitchell carried the casket. Their movements were precise, reverent, their faces tear-streaked. Thomas read from the letter his mother wrote, the one that never reached its destination until decades later. "He came home to us," Thomas said, voice thick, "in every way that mattered." The 21-gun salute echoed across the field, not as a farewell, but as an exclamation of a life reclaimed. Later, in the museum wing of the base's historical hall, a new installation opened. Echoes in the Silence. The story of Sergeant John Harris. Inside were the torn fragments of the letter Martha wrote, the flag he carried for 52 years, and a digital screen looping the Veterans Day footage. But the centerpiece was a glass case containing John's final journal. Visitors were encouraged to read its last entry, then write their own reflections on a wall titled for those who came home silent. Over the months, the wall filled, with names, with stories, with apologies, with love. Years passed, and the world, as it always does, moved forward. But every Veterans Day, at Aberdeen Proving Ground, a chair is placed on stage beside the podium. Empty, but draped with a folded uniform jacket. Beside it, a plaque, in honor of Sergeant John Harris, who taught us that silence is not the end of a story, only a pause waiting for courage. May we always listen and remember. In the end, John Harris found not only peace, but purpose. He showed a nation that remembering isn't just ceremony, it is responsibility. And when he finally laid down the burden he had carried for decades, he did so knowing that it was no longer just his to bear. Speak the name, answer the silence, and in that echo, he lived on.